The wind swept across the golden plains, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and the low hum of life that pulsed through the vast wilderness, but in the heart of that endless sea of grass, there was tension coiled as tightly as a drawn bowstring. Thunderhoof, a massive bull buffalo with shoulders like rolling hills and eyes deep as storm clouds, stood rooted to the earth, his great head low, his breath steaming in the crisp morning air as he stared toward the source of a cry that pierced the sky. It was not the call of a crow or the chatter of a hawk, but a high, terrified bleat. His son, still young enough to cling close to his mother, had wandered too far toward a shallow rise where the grass thinned to reveal open ground, and now above him circled a shadow with talons like curved knives, an eagle so large and old its feathers seemed the color of midnight, wings beating with a sound that could be heard even over the wind. The calf stumbled, confused by the sudden darkness that swept over him, and when the eagle dropped, folding its wings and cutting through the air like a thrown spear, the world seemed to slow. Thunderhoof's muscles bunched, his hooves dug deep furrows into the damp soil, and he charged, the earth shaking beneath his weight, each stride carrying the fury of a father and the will of a survivor who had seen too many seasons end in loss, the scars along his flank reminders of wolves driven back, storms weathered, and the long, hungry winters endured. The eagle struck, talons finding purchase in the calf's hide, and the young buffalo's scream tore through the air. But before the bird could lift its prey, Thunderhoof's horn caught it in a sweeping arc, knocking it aside in a burst of feathers, his massive head swinging again to block any further attempt as he planted himself between his son and the predator, nostrils flaring, his roar like rolling thunder echoing across the grasslands. The eagle, undeterred, rose into the air again, circling, its keen eyes fixed on the calf, calculating, patient, but Thunderhoof would not yield. The plains had taught him that predators waited for hesitation, for the moment when fear overruled resolve, and he would give none. Even as his son pressed against his leg, trembling, blood trickling down from shallow cuts in his side. From the ridge beyond, other shapes appeared. Not buffalo, but two humans, a man and a woman in khaki jackets, binoculars swinging at their chests, their truck parked far back near the dirt road, and though their voices carried only faintly, Thunderhoof caught the tone. Urgency, perhaps even alarm, as they saw the eagle's repeated dives and the bull's defiance. The woman pointed, gesturing toward the calf, and the man began moving along the ridge, careful but quick, though Thunderhoof paid them little mind. His world was narrowed to the shadow above, the scent of his calf's blood, and the raw instinct that love was worth standing for even when the odds clawed at you from the sky. The eagle dove again, faster this time, aiming not for the calf but for Thunderhoof's eyes, and the bull reared his head, taking the blow along his horn and forehead, feathers bursting around him, the impact ringing through his skull but not enough to stagger him. His son cried out again, and that sound, small, desperate, trusting, ignited something deeper than instinct, something like choice, and with a snort that blew dust from the earth, Thunderhoof lunged not away but toward the eagle's path, predicting its sweep, cutting across its arc with a speed and precision born not of chance but of knowing the ways of hunters, his horn raking air just beneath the bird's talons and forcing it higher. The humans had stopped now, watching with a stillness that came from awe rather than fear, the woman lifting a camera but lowering it again as if sensing that this was not a moment to be captured, but one to be witnessed. The eagle wheeled once more, its cry a piercing challenge, but this time it did not dive. Instead it turned toward the horizon, vanishing into the distant haze where the plains met the sky, leaving only the trembling silence after danger passes. Thunderhoof lowered his head, touching his muzzle to his calf's neck, breathing him in, reassuring him, and the little one leaned into that touch, his shaking slowing as the humans began to approach from a safe distance, their movements gentle, almost reverent. The man spoke in a low voice to the woman, a tone tinged with disbelief, and though Thunderhoof did not know their words, he felt no threat from them. Only something quieter, like respect, or perhaps the kind of understanding that bridges the divide between species. The wind shifted, carrying the first cold drops of rain from the storm that had been waiting on the horizon, and Thunderhoof turned toward the herd in the distance, knowing the safety there was not complete but stronger for being shared, his calf keeping close to his side. Far behind, the humans stood in the rain, watching the two figures move away into the swaying grass, and somewhere in their hearts a seed had been planted, the kind that grows into a story told and retold, a story of a wild creature who had chosen to stand, to protect, and to love without hesitation. But as Thunderhoof led his son home, the storm rolled closer, and with it came the shadow of new trials. The kind that could not be fought with horns alone, and in that gathering darkness the first embers of the next challenge began to glow. The storm broke before the herd could find shelter, the sky splitting open with blinding flashes that turned the rolling plains into a landscape of silver and shadow, each jagged bolt revealing the shapes of buffalo huddled close together, heads low, their breath steaming in the cold air. But Thunderhoof kept himself at the edge of the group, his body a barrier between the open land and his calf, who pressed against his flank with every crash of thunder. Rain pelted the ground so hard it bounced in tiny explosions of mud, and the wind howled through the grass like the voice of something ancient and restless. But even as the herd shifted uneasily, Thunderhoof's eyes scanned the distance, the memory of the eagle's talons still fresh in his mind. Not because he feared it would return in the storm, but because he had learned that one predator often meant another was not far behind. The woman from the ridge, her hair plastered to her face by the downpour, now moved quickly alongside the man, both wearing rain-slick jackets, their boots sinking into the sodden earth as they approached from the far side of the herd, careful not to spook the animals. Thunderhoof could smell them long before they were close, that strange mix of leather, soap, and something metallic, but there was no threat in their scent, only purpose, though he could not yet know what it was. The man held something long and wrapped in plastic, while the woman carried a small metal case that jingled faintly when she moved, and though the wind snatched their words, Thunderhoof caught their intent in the way they glanced toward his calf, the way their bodies leaned forward with urgency. These were not hunters, they were something else entirely. The herd began to shift, moving toward a shallow depression in the land where the wind cut less sharply, but Thunderhoof resisted, unwilling to turn his back on the humans or to leave the open space where he could see approaching danger. And as the herd drifted away in the curtain of rain, the humans came closer, their steps slow now, one hand raised in what seemed to be a gesture of peace. The calf shivered at Thunderhoof's side, a thin line of dried blood still visible beneath the wet fur on his flank, and Thunderhoof lowered his head, swinging it just enough to block the human's path. The woman stopped, crouching low in the mud, her eyes never leaving his, and for a long moment there was only the pounding of the rain and the soft tremor of the calf against his leg. Then, in a motion so careful it seemed almost hesitant, she opened the metal case and took out a white cloth, holding it out for him to see. There was no weapon, only a scent like plants and earth, faint under the storm. Thunderhoof could have turned away, could have led his son deeper into the safety of the herd, but something in the way the woman stayed low, letting the rain soak her through without moving toward him, told him this was not the moment to flee. Instead, he shifted just enough for the calf to be visible, his eyes never leaving hers, and the man stepped forward, kneeling beside the woman, opening the plastic-wrapped object to reveal a long pole with a loop of rope at the end. Not for harm, but for control if needed, the kind Thunderhoof had once seen used by men to free another buffalo from a fallen fence. The calf's wound was not deep, but the humans seemed intent on tending it, their hands moving in silent coordination. And as the rain blurred the world into shades of gray, Thunderhoof stood like a dark statue over them, watching every motion. When the woman finally pressed the cloth to the calf's side, the little one flinched but did not bolt, reassured by his father's presence, and Thunderhoof caught a glimmer in her eyes. Gratitude, perhaps, or wonder at being allowed this close. The wind shifted again, carrying with it a scent that made Thunderhoof's muscles tighten. Not the eagle, but something lower to the ground, sharper, edged. With hunger, the woman froze too, as if she had caught it as well, and the man's head turned toward the darkness at the edge of the storm where the grass bent unnaturally. Shapes began to emerge. First one, then two, then more, lean and deliberate, their bodies moving low against the earth, eyes glinting in the dim light. Coyotes, larger than the ones Thunderhoof had chased before, their coats slick from the rain but their hunger undiminished, drawn by the scent of blood. The humans rose slowly, the man gripping the pole, the woman backing toward him, but Thunderhoof stepped forward before they could act, placing himself between them and the oncoming shapes, the rain streaming down his broad back as his hooves dug into the sodden ground. The lead coyote paused, gauging him, its ears flicking back at the sight of so much muscle and horn, but hunger makes creatures bold, and it took another step forward, the others fanning out to flank him. The calf pressed into Thunderhoof's hind leg, trembling, and in that moment the bull knew the choice before him was not simply to fight or to flee. It was to stand and risk himself not only for his son, but for the humans who had come to help, or to retreat and protect his strength for battles yet to come. He lowered his head, the tips of his horns glinting pale under a flash of lightning, and the air between him and the coyotes seemed to tighten like a drawn bowstring. The woman spoke then, her voice low but firm, carrying even through the storm, and though Thunderhoof could not understand the words, he understood the rhythm. It was steady, unafraid, the sound of someone who believed he would not fall. The first coyote lunged, and Thunderhoof met it with a sidestep and a brutal swing of his head that sent it sprawling into the mud, its yelp lost in the roar of the wind, and the others froze for a heartbeat too long. The man stepped forward then, swinging the pole in a wide arc to keep them at bay, and together, beast and human, they formed a line that would not break. The coyotes, sensing the balance shift, began to retreat, slinking back into the storm's veil until only the sound of the rain remained, and Thunderhoof exhaled a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The humans relaxed but did not approach again, instead stepping back with slow, deliberate movements, their eyes lingering on him with a kind of respect rarely given freely to the wild. Thunderhoof turned toward his son, nudging him gently, feeling the small body lean into his own, and as the storm began to pass, leaving the plains glistening under the dim light, he led the calf toward the distant shape of the herd, knowing that the danger had only deepened, that something about today had shifted the world around them, drawing lines between lives that might never have crossed otherwise, and that the bond formed in the rain was not yet finished being tested. The air after the storm was thick and metallic, the smell of wet earth mingling with the faint tang of blood, and though the rain had thinned to a soft mist that clung to fur and skin alike, the land felt heavier, quieter, as if holding its breath in anticipation of something unseen. Thunderhoof moved slowly across the sodden ground, each step sinking into the softened earth with a muffled thud, his calf limping beside him but keeping pace, eyes darting between the shifting shadows in the grass. For though the coyotes had withdrawn into the storm shroud, he knew predators rarely abandoned a hunt entirely. They simply waited for the next weakness. The herd was not far, their shapes emerging as a loose wall of dark bodies against the gray horizon, and as Thunderhoof approached, a few younger bulls lifted their heads, their nostrils flaring as they caught the scent of both humans and danger lingering on him. But none moved to challenge him, for the weight of his presence, magnified by the battle scent still fresh on his horns, was enough to command silence. The calf eased closer to the safety of the herd, but Thunderhoof did not follow fully. His eyes remained fixed on the ridge where the humans had vanished into the thinning rain, the woman's crouched form and the man's steady grip on the pole still sharp in his mind, not as a threat, but as a question. They had not harmed him, nor had they fled when the predators came, and in that strange moment of shared defense, the line between wild and human had blurred, leaving a trace of something unfamiliar in his chest, something like recognition. Night crept over the plains faster than he expected, the clouds blotting out the fading sun, and the temperature dropped until his breath rose in steady white clouds, but sleep did not come easily. Every rustle of grass, every distant snap of a branch sent his ears flicking toward the sound. His muscles coiled for movement, and beneath the rhythm of the wind he thought he could hear something else, faint but steady, like the beat of hooves on wet ground. When it came again, closer this time, the herd shifted uneasily, calves pressing against their mothers, bulls snorting low warnings, and Thunderhoof moved toward the sound, his broad body sliding between the others to take the front. The shapes that emerged from the darkness were not coyotes this time, nor wolves, but horses, 5 of them, sleek and restless, their riders hunched low against the cold, the glint of metal and leather marking them as hunters. They moved with purpose, fanning out slowly, their eyes scanning the herd with the cold patience of those who knew the value of meat and hide. Thunderhoof's muscles tightened as one rider pointed toward the cluster where his calf stood, the man's voice cutting through the night in a sharp order that the horses seemed to understand instantly, for they began to move in a slow arc meant to drive the herd toward a narrow gully nearby, a trap where movement would be limited. The herd's leaders began to press against one another, confusion rippling through them, but Thunderhoof stepped forward, his breath loud in the stillness, and with a sudden bellow that shattered the night, he charged, not toward the horses themselves, but toward the line they were forming, slamming his hooves into the wet ground with a force that sent water spraying high. The hunters reacted quickly, the lead horse rearing as its rider pulled hard on the reins. The sudden break in their formation creating a gap wide enough for part of the herd to slip away into the darker stretch of plain. The riders shouted, 2 breaking off to pursue the fleeing buffalo while the others turned to cut Thunderhoof off, but the bull wheeled sharply, his horns catching the faint starlight as he made himself a moving wall between the hunters and the rest of the herd. One rider drew something from his side, a long, thin spear tipped with metal that glinted pale, and spurred his horse forward, the animal's hoofs pounding against the wet ground as it closed the distance. Thunderhoof did not retreat, instead lowering his head until the tips of his horns pointed directly at the horse's chest, and in the instant before impact the rider yanked hard on the reins, forcing the animal to veer sharply to avoid being gored. But the momentum carried them too close and Thunderhoof's flank slammed into the horse's side, sending both rider and mount stumbling into the mud. The man cursed, scrambling to his feet as the horse regained its balance, but the sound was drowned by another. Hoofbeats again, heavier this time, and from the darkness the humans from the ridge appeared, not on horses but running, the man carrying the same long pole, the woman with a metal case now slung over her shoulder. They did not shout or wave, but their arrival drew the hunter's eyes for just long enough that Thunderhoof pressed his advantage, driving forward in a series of short, brutal charges that broke the remaining formation entirely. The herd scattered wide into the night, their dark bodies vanishing into the plain, and though the hunters tried to regroup, the combined disruption from both bull and humans made the chase disorganized, the riders' curses fading into the distance as they realized the herd was lost to them. When the danger had passed, the woman approached slowly, her breath visible in the cold air, and though she made no move to touch him, she stood near enough that he could hear the uneven rhythm of her breathing. The man stayed farther back, scanning the darkness as if expecting the hunters to return, but the only sounds now were the settling wind and the faint drip of water from grass blades. Thunderhoof's calf reappeared from the shadows, trotting unsteadily toward him, and the woman's eyes followed the young one with something like relief. She spoke then, her words low and steady, the tone carrying the same calm as before, and though the meaning was still lost on him, the sound itself felt like a thread connecting two worlds that should never have touched. She pointed toward the east, where the faintest hint of pale light was beginning to stain the horizon, and then toward the calf, her expression tightening as if weighing a decision. Thunderhoof followed her gaze, the smell of the hunters still lingering on the air, and in that moment he understood that whatever safety the herd could offer here was temporary, that the plains had changed, that danger now came not only from the wild but from men who hunted with purpose and skill. The humans turned then, walking toward the ridge with the same measured pace as before, not looking back, and Thunderhoof stood watching until their shapes dissolved into the lightning mist. He led his calf east, away from the gully, keeping to the higher ground where the wind carried scents farther, and as the sun began to rise, casting gold over the wet plains, he knew that the next storm, whether of rain, claw, or steel, was already on its way, and that when it came, the strange alliance born in the heart of the last would be tested in ways neither beast nor human could yet imagine. ChatGPT. By the time the sun had fully breached the horizon, turning the soaked plains into a vast sheet of glistening gold, Thunderhoof and his calf had already covered several miles eastward, the ground rising and falling beneath their hooves in long, gentle swells, the kind of terrain where the wind could carry a warning far ahead of the eye. The herd was now a distant memory, their scent faded into the shifting air, and though a part of him knew that returning would mean safety in numbers, another part, older, deeper, understood that staying mobile was the only way to survive the new kind of predator that rode on four legs but thought like a wolf. The calf stumbled once on a patch of soft mud but quickly righted itself, determination in its small frame mirroring Thunderhoof's own, and they moved onward until the land began to change, the grass thinning into a mix of stone and scrub, and in the far distance, the faint shimmer of water under the strengthening sun. Instinct urged him toward it, for water meant not only life but the chance to mask their scent from anything tracking them, and so they descended toward the glimmer, weaving through outcroppings of weathered rock where lizards basked motionless in the new light. The air here was different, carrying the tang of minerals and the faint, acrid trace of smoke, not from fire on the plain but from something more controlled, human-made. Thunderhoof slowed, his ears swiveling as he scanned the horizon, and it was then he saw movement, low shapes against the ground, almost invisible except for the occasional glint of metal. The calf pressed close to his side, sensing the tension in his muscles, but no immediate danger presented itself, so they continued cautiously until they reached the edge of a shallow basin where the water collected in a long, narrow pool. The surface was calm, disturbed only by the occasional ripple of an insect, and Thunderhoof lowered his head to drink, the cool liquid washing away the dryness from his throat, the calf following suit. It was only when the reflection on the water shifted that he realized they were not alone. A figure crouched on the opposite bank, motionless, their face partly obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. but the eyes beneath it locked on his with an intensity that was neither hostile nor afraid. The scent on the wind told him it was not one of the riders from the night before, nor one of the two humans from the ridge, but someone else entirely. The figure rose slowly, revealing a lean frame wrapped in patched leather, and in one hand they carried a curved tool that caught the light in a dull sheen, its edge worn from use. They spoke then, their voice low and even, not in the same tongue as the woman but carrying the same calm cadence, and though the meaning was lost, the tone seemed to invite neither flight nor fight. Thunderhoof did not move closer, but he did not retreat either, watching as the stranger set the curved tool down on the ground and stepped back, leaving a small pile of something beside it, roots, stripped of dirt and cut into pieces. The scent was sharp, earthy, not quite food for him but not unpleasant, and the calf, curious, took a tentative step toward the bank, only for Thunderhoof to block it gently with his body. The stranger waited, unmoving, as if understanding that trust was not something to be rushed. After a long moment, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the rocks, leaving the roots and the tool untouched. Thunderhoof remained by the water until the sun climbed higher, the basin warming under its gaze, and when he finally led the calf away, he noticed the faint trail of human footprints leading eastward, parallel to their own intended path. The day grew hotter, the air wavering above the ground, and by midday the calf began to tire, its pace slowing, but just as Thunderhoof considered stopping in the shade of a rock face, a sound rolled across the plains, a deep, rhythmic thump that at first seemed like distant thunder, but grew sharper, more mechanical, until the memory of the hunter's horses stirred in his mind. Yet this was different, heavier, and soon the shape emerged over a rise. A massive wooden cart pulled by two broad, pale animals, their sides lathered in sweat, and seated atop it were three humans, one holding the reins while the others scanned the land with narrow-eyed focus. The cart was laden with hides, some still fresh enough to glisten in the sun, and the stench of death clung to it so strongly that Thunderhoof felt his skin twitch. He guided the calf into the shelter of the rocks, pressing them low as the cart rumbled past, the men speaking in sharp, clipped bursts, their hands resting near the long sticks of metal strapped to the side. Sticks that carried the same cold scent as the hunter's spear tips. They did not see him, their focus fixed ahead, but their path led in the same direction as the footprints by the basin, and an unease settled in his chest. When the sound of wheels faded, Thunderhoof emerged, his gaze lingering on the tracks they left behind. Deep, straight, unbroken. The sky began to shift in the late afternoon, thin clouds pulling across the sun and cooling the land, and as evening neared, he caught sight of something on the horizon, smoke, thin and pale, rising from what appeared to be a cluster of shapes too ordered to be natural. Buildings, though smaller than the human dens he had seen near the far western ridges. Seasons ago, the calf's steps quickened at the scent of cooking food drifting faintly on the breeze, though the smell of burning wood and animal fat made Thunderhoof wary. They approached slowly, staying downwind, and soon the shapes took form. Tents of hide, low wooden frames, and drying racks heavy with strips of meat. Humans moved among them, some working with tools, others tending to fires, and at the far edge of the camp, he saw the figure from the basin, speaking to a taller human with broad shoulders and a necklace made of teeth. The tall one's gaze turned toward the open plain, scanning, and Thunderhoof felt the weight of it even from this distance. The calf shifted uneasily, and though the settlement showed no immediate threat, the memory of the cart and the hunters painted the same conclusion. These people lived by taking from the land, and anything that wandered too close could become part of their stores. Night began to fall, the campfires casting orange halos against the deepening blue of the sky, and Thunderhoof led the calf away, circling wide until the lights were swallowed by distance. They traveled under the stars, guided by the wind and the subtle rise of the land, and as the moon climbed high, pale and watchful, Thunderhoof could not shake the feeling that the paths of men and buffalo were drawing closer, pulled by some unseen current, and that before long, the choice to avoid them would no longer be his to make. ChatGPT. The moon hung high and cold above the endless sweep of the plain, its pale light silvering the grass and casting long shadows that swayed in rhythm with the wind, and Thunderhoof moved in near silence save for the faint rustle of the calves' smallest steps close behind, each breath from their nostrils clouding in the chill air. The land before them was unfamiliar yet somehow threaded with scents from far away, distant rain to the south, dust from a herd long gone to the west, and faint traces of human presence carried by shifting currents. The stars above wheeled slowly, their ancient patterns steady against the slow-moving clouds, and Thunderhoof found his path more by instinct than sight, letting the gentle undulations of the earth guide him toward a place where the grass grew thicker and the ground held moisture even in the dry months. By the time the horizon began to pale with the promise of dawn, he sensed the change in the air, warmer, heavier, carrying the smell of stagnant water, and the faint, sour tang of decay. The calf's ears twitched nervously, but Thunderhoof pressed on, knowing that in such places waterholes often hid beneath the reeds and mud, a necessary risk after the long night's march. As the light grew, the shapes of low trees emerged, their branches twisted and sparse, and beyond them lay a broad depression in the land where water glimmered darkly under a thin mist. A flock of wading birds lifted at their approach, their cries sharp and echoing, and Thunderhoof slowed to drink, lowering his head cautiously, the calf stepping to his side. The water was cool but carried a faint bitterness that spoke of minerals deep in the soil, and he drank only enough to ease the thirst before lifting his head to scan the horizon. It was then he saw them, small dark shapes moving low along the rise to the east, their movements too smooth to be wolves and too slow to be riders. The wind shifted and carried their scent. Men, more than one, moving deliberately. Thunderhoof nudged the calf, urging it toward the far edge of the depression, their hooves sinking slightly into the damp ground before finding firmer soil. They moved into the cover of the low trees, weaving among their trunks until the plain opened again, but the men were gone from sight, replaced by the far-off shimmer of heat where the sun had begun to climb. The morning passed in steady travel, the land rising into a series of rocky ridges that cut across the plain like the backs of sleeping giants, and it was in one of the narrow valleys between them that Thunderhoof caught a new scent, sharp, acrid, and laced with the faint sweetness of sap. He paused, nostrils flaring, and then he saw the source. A line of sharpened stakes driven into the ground, each tipped with a smear of dark resin that glistened in the sun. They were arranged in a narrowing V-shape, the kind of design that funneled fleeing prey toward a single killing ground, and though the stakes were weathered, some still bore fresh signs of repair. He skirted the trap wide, keeping the calf close, his mind marking the place as a sign that these ridges were hunted ground. Hours later, as the heat began to wane and the sky deepened to a richer blue, the sound of water reached his ears again, but this time it was moving water, tumbling over stone. They followed it to a narrow stream running clear and cold between two ridges, its banks lined with willow and thick grass, and Thunderhoof drank deeply here. Knowing that such clean sources were rare, the calf splashed briefly in the shallows, its youthful energy returning, but the peace was broken by a sudden, distant crack, sharp, unnatural, echoing against the stone. The birds took flight in a startled flurry, and Thunderhoof froze, the memory of the hunter's weapons stirring in his mind. The sound came again, followed by a faint shout, and though the distance made the words indistinct, the tone was urgent. He led the calf away from the stream, climbing the rocky slope until they reached a vantage point where the land beyond opened wide. There, less than a mile away, men on horseback were circling a cluster of large, shaggy animals. Buffalo, but smaller in number and scattered in confusion. The riders moved with practiced precision, driving the animals toward another narrow cut in the ridges where the ground dropped sharply. And even from here Thunderhoof could sense the panic in the herd. A third crack split the air, and one of the buffalo stumbled, its legs folding before it vanished into the dust. The calf pressed against him, trembling at the smell of blood on the wind, and Thunderhoof turned them away, heading deeper into the ridges where the noise faded to a dull echo. The day slipped toward evening, and the land grew quieter save for the whisper of wind through the grass, but the memory of the hunt lingered, a reminder that the human's reach extended far beyond sight. When the first stars began to appear, Thunderhoof found a sheltered hollow beneath an overhanging ledge, the floor soft with old leaves, and they rested there, the calf curled close against his side. The night passed uneventfully, and at dawn they moved on, the ridges gradually giving way to a wide plain scattered with boulders and the occasional lone tree. It was here that Thunderhoof caught sight of a familiar figure moving along the horizon, the lean human from the basin, carrying the same curved tool over one shoulder. Their pace was steady, and though the distance between them was wide, Thunderhoof sensed they were traveling in the same general direction. For 2 days their paths ran parallel, sometimes drawing closer, sometimes diverging, but never crossing directly, as if both understood the unspoken rule of distance. On the third morning, the plain ahead darkened with clouds, the air heavy with the promise of rain, and when the storm broke it swept the land in a curtain of water, washing away scents and softening the earth. Thunderhoof moved easily through the downpour, his thick coat shedding the worst of it, and the calf leapt and kicked at the puddles in bursts of play. By afternoon the storm had passed, leaving the world fresh and bright, and in its wake came the low, steady drum of hooves, not his own, but many, growing louder. He turned toward the sound and saw them cresting a rise, a great herd, perhaps hundreds strong, moving as one across the plain, their bodies dark against the wet grass. The sight struck something deep within him, a pull older than memory, and without thought he began to angle toward them, the calf following. The herd's pace was swift but not panicked, and soon they were close enough for the scents to mingle. Earth, rain, warm bodies, and the faint tang of milk. As they merged with the outer edge, Thunderhoof felt the shift in the calf's energy, the joy of belonging again after so many lonely miles, and for a time he allowed himself to simply move with them, hooves striking in rhythm with hundreds of others. Yet even in this great company, his gaze swept the horizon, knowing that safety was never absolute, and that somewhere beyond sight the humans still watched, planned, and followed. ChatGPT. The days with the herd passed in a blur of movement and sound, the thunder of countless hooves drumming through the ground and the steady rhythm of grazing and marching filling each hour with the comfort of routine. Yet Thunderhoof remained ever aware of the shifting patterns within the great mass of bodies, noting how the leaders kept to the front and the strong bulls formed a loose barrier around the flanks while the calves stayed in the heart of the moving tide. And though he and the young one were welcomed into this protective core by virtue of their position, he never truly let his guard drop. The plain stretched endlessly in all directions, sometimes rolling gently, sometimes flattening into wide sweeps of grass broken only by the silhouettes of distant trees or the dark flashes of predators shadowing the herd's edges, but the constant motion kept danger at bay for the most part. Each dawn began with the low murmurs of the herd awakening, a rustling and shifting as the mass prepared to move, and each night ended in the slow spiraling inward toward a loosely gathered rest, where the bodies pressed close for warmth and the soft sounds of breathing mingled with the sigh of the wind through the grass. On the fourth morning, a change came, subtle at first, a restlessness in the older cows, the bulls lifting their heads more often, sniffing the air, the pace increasing slightly until Thunderhoof too caught the scent that pulled them onward. Fresh water, carried faint but distinct on the rising breeze. The sun climbed higher, and with it the urgency grew, the herd breaking into a long steady trot toward the promise ahead, and by midday they reached it. A vast, shallow lake rimmed with reeds and dotted with the white glints of waterbirds, its surface rippling under the wind. The herd fanned out along the shore, lowering their heads to drink, and for a time all was calm save for the splashing of hooves and the soft grunts of satisfaction. But it was here that Thunderhoof saw them again, humans, small dark shapes against the pale sweep of the far shore, moving with deliberate slowness, some bending to the water, others standing watch with long, glinting tools in their hands. The distance was great, yet the tension it stirred in him was immediate, and he kept the calf close, drinking quickly before leading it back toward the cover of the thicker grass at the edge of the lake. The herd lingered through the afternoon, grazing on the lush growth that surrounded the water, and as the sun began to sink the humans on the far shore vanished into the low hills beyond. But Thunderhoof knew they had not simply disappeared, only moved to another place from which they might strike. That night the herd remained near the lake, the bulls keeping a wider patrol than usual, their silhouettes moving steadily under the starlight, and in the hours before dawn, a sudden ripple of alarm passed through the sleeping mass as distant cracks split the air, muffled, but unmistakable, followed by the faint panicked cries of some other herd beyond the hills. The sound faded quickly, but it left the air heavy with unease, and when morning came the leaders drove the herd away from the lake, setting a pace that carried them steadily eastward. The land here grew drier, the grass thinner, and the horizon broken by jagged outcrops of stone that rose like the bones of the earth itself, and it